What if I told you that companies cutting back on diversity, equity, and inclusion are actually choosing to be less profitable? Sounds extreme? Well, research shows that companies in the top quartile for gender and ethnic diversity are 9% more likely to outperform their peers. And those in the bottom quartile, they're a staggering 66% less likely to succeed. So when businesses scale back on DEI initiatives, what they're really doing is making a bet against their own future. And it's not just about corporate performance. It's about you. Have you ever felt unstoppable? Like nothing could get in your way until suddenly it did? That's what privilege and bias feel like. You don't notice the wind at your back until you have to turn around and fight against it. 60% of employees report experiencing workplace bias. And if you're one of them, research shows you're nearly 3 times more likely to feel disengaged at work. And disengagement, that leads to lower innovation, career stagnation, and companies losing their best talent. So, what happens when businesses ignore these forces? What happens when they cave to external pressures and walk away from the very thing that fuels growth and innovation? Today, we're going to explore those questions with someone who knows exactly what's at stake, Dr. Sarah Kaplan. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Kaplan, a distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, author of the 360-Degree Corporation, and a globally recognized expert on gender equity and business strategy. She's advised corporations, governments, and policymakers on everything from boardroom diversity to pay equity. And today, she's here to help us unpack the real consequences of rolling back DEI.
Sarah, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate this conversation that we're having. It's going to be so important for us going in the future to think about some of the things that we need to think about as women leaders. And so for the listener, what I want to ask you is, have you ever bought something, maybe a pair of sneakers, Nike sneakers, a new phone, or even just a cup of coffee, and ever wondered how it was made? And the chances are that behind the product, a company had to make some tough choices. Did they pay their factory workers a living wage, or did they have to keep the prices competitive? Did they use sustainable materials or maximize short-term profits? These decisions are what Dr. Sarah Kaplan calls trade-offs. And they're not just corporate dilemmas. They affect the products we buy, the jobs we have, and even how our workplaces operate. And here's the kicker. Companies that ignore these trade-offs don't just fail their workers or their customers. They often set themselves up for their own failure. So what are the trade-offs really? And how do they shape everything from global brands to your own career? So Dr. Kaplan, can you talk about trade-offs as a necessary part of business strategy, but people might not fully understand what they mean? Can you give us a clear example of maybe something like Nike's labor practices or other industries where companies had to navigate difficult trade-offs?
Well, thank you so much for having me join your podcast, and looking forward to this conversation so much. So a big theme in my work is this idea that we can use innovation in pursuit of social goods. That could be gender equality, that could be environmental issues, that could be, as you mentioned, labor practices. But the idea is really to bring an innovation lens to those questions. And so you mentioned, for example, Nike labor practices. I think it's a great example. So for those people who remember back in like the late 90s, Nike, who makes all these fabulous shoes and sportswear, had come under assault through social media, through activists, because of its labor practices, primarily in places like Vietnam, and where workers were, underpaid, working, too hard under very poor conditions. And at first, the CEO at the time, Phil Knight, was super resistant to this. He said, look, this isn't our company. These are our suppliers. But at some point, he realized that, the suppliers are still part of the Nike ecosystem, and therefore something was going to have to change. And what they didn't do is just do the compliance. Like, okay, there's some labor regulations. We're just going to throw them at these suppliers and see what happens. Instead, they actually embarked on a many years long journey of discovery that involved academic researchers and their own internal teams to look at what could they really do differently to improve these labor practices. And so it wasn't just demanding that the factories did better. They actually redesigned management practices. They trained the managers in the factories. And so there was a lot that they did to innovate into how the factory work happened. But they also then looked at the entire process and said, well, we can't just fix the factories. We have to fix the fact that we are constantly sending in last minute orders. Well, we have to change that because last minute orders is part of what makes things difficult. We have to redesign our products so that there are fewer toxic glues in them because the toxic glues are bad for the workers. We have to change our whole design process. So Nike headquarters had to change along with the changes that happened in the factories. And so this was, as I said, a long process of discovery that allowed them to innovate in lots of the ways that they did business across the whole supply chain that then broke the trade-off. The trade-off was originally, well, it was going to be too hard, expensive to have better labor practices, but by innovating, they actually were able to improve labor practices and actually improve the whole way that they did business. So that's one example of where trade-offs exist and how you can use innovation to think differently about that.
I think that's wonderful. And I'm so glad that from a social perspective, they felt the pressure to do that. And when you think about that whole chain, can you identify who the stakeholders were in these decisions and why the average person should really care?
Yeah. So that's a great question because stakeholders are basically any groups of people or the environment that are impacted by your operations. So in this case, the stakeholders were clearly the workers, but then there were other stakeholders like the employees at headquarters as well, and, environmental degradation. So you want to think about that more broadly and just be attentive to who is being impacted by your business. And one thing that I want to say about this process is that if you kind of look at it from the beginning and think, oh, we're going to have to make all these changes, it's going to look like too expensive and too hard, and a lot of companies will resist. But, once Nike went through the journey, they got these huge upside benefits, more productivity in the factories, more satisfied workers who stayed longer, therefore did a better, produced better quality products. So they had better productivity, higher quality. And so if they hadn't gone on this journey, they wouldn't have gotten that. But looking at it in advance, you might say, oh, this is too hard or too expensive. And
Right.
that Nike example shows that it's worth it. It's not too hard and too expensive for the benefits that you ultimately get.
In the end, so they got a lot of benefits. What if they would have ignored it? What if they would have said, oh, this is too hard? What do you think would have happened?
Well, I think it was pretty clear what was happening, which was they were getting a lot of very negative social media. I mean, at the time, it was the late 90s and the 2000s. So, it wasn't all social media, but it was media. It was pressure from stakeholders. It was activists. And, that was just going to continue. And then, they've had subsequent, because it's a ongoing journey. They're not perfect. So they, have had other times when people have called them out for other things. So I think it could have been degradation of the brand. It could have been canceling of, contracts. We don't know what would have happened, but it definitely, they wouldn't have been able to realize the benefits that they realized. And so they wouldn't have had more productivity, higher quality, and all these things. So I don't think it's worth ignoring.
When we take a look at some of the things that are happening today, we see diversity and equity and inclusion coming down. It's once been seen as a business must, and now it's under attack with critics calling it performative or even harmful. But here's the real question I have to ask. Was it ever really truly authentic, or was it just another corporate trend? And if companies are actually scaling back, what does that mean for us professionals who really still believe in equity?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question to ask because we're right in the midst of now a full reevaluation of these kinds of issues. And you said, well, it was once a must-have. I'm not sure it was ever really a must-have because I think a lot of there was social pressure and there's a lot of investors who've been asking for this and pushing on diversity. But I think it's still been, even with all of that, a big uphill battle. And of course, the uphill battle just got more steep because of the DEI backlash and all of that. And it's really unfortunate. Those companies who are walking back their commitments, I think it's a huge loss for those companies because they're going to be giving up performance. They're going to be giving up innovation. And I think it's really problematic. Um, you know, I think a lot of companies didn't want to do the hard work and so said a lot of nice things publicly. I'm not sure, to really do it right, it can't be a side of the desk kind of thing. Like I have my day job and then I do this DEI on the side of my desk. And yet I think a lot of people did feel like it was an add-on. And so maybe one of the positive things that's coming out of this moment is that people are realizing when you treat it just as an add-on or something that you do for the media, it's not authentic, as you said. And so I think a lot of companies are probably thinking about how can we make it more authentic? How can we really build it into everything that we do? Let's not separately call it DEI. Let's just talk about it, achieving excellence in our organization. And so I think a lot of companies are going to stop talking about DEI, but they are going to be really they know the benefits are there. So they're going to try to build it in to everything they do. And I think this whole backlash at DEI is based on, it's a political project, but, to undermine equality. But I think it's also been really misunderstood and twisted by opponents as somehow, we're going to give all these huge advantages to people who haven't had advantages before. And that's going to be horrible for the people who are, historically been in positions of power. But really what diversity, equity, inclusion has only ever been about is about leveling the playing field.
Right.
There's a lot of people who have had wind in their sails and they're still working hard and they feel like they're working hard. And I want to honor the fact that they feel like they're working hard, but they don't understand that with their hard work, they have the wind in their sails so they can advance faster than the people who actually have all the headwinds, who are working equally hard, but can't get ahead. And those wind in your sails is completely invisible to you. And so you don't understand. And so you think that equality feels like oppression to people who have historically been in positions of power. But, the research shows, like even research on quotas now, DEI was very rarely been about quotas, but even research on quotas has shown that actually the average quality goes up when you have quotas in place. Why? Because you're actually including people who've historically been overlooked and they're very high quality. And when you include them, what you get is overall average quality because you're including them, but maybe you're not including some of the mediocre people who had wind in their sails and so got ahead, but really didn't deserve it relative to some other people who were actually better qualified. And so, what I feel like companies that are walking back on DEI or were never committed to it are basically saying, we will pay to be less diverse. Like we're willing to give up profits. We're willing to give up innovation. We're willing to give up talent just to be less diverse. And I don't think that people think about it that way. They think that this is just an assault on the existing system as opposed to understanding it's actually a mission to create greater excellence in organizations. And that reframing, that misunderstanding, I think, has what allowed this DEI backlash to actually take place. But I really feel like if people understood that the whole point was actually to improve the excellence of organizations, and I think that's where many companies are now going to go with this, then I think we would inoculate ourselves against the backlash a little bit.
So, and I love the notion of the wind in your sails because I think about running. Sometimes I get out there and I run with the wind to my back and I feel like I can go forever and I'm going in one direction. Now I have to turn around and go the other way. And I'm thinking to myself, holy cow, what just hit me? And you spoke a little bit about how companies will adapt in the future by it's not going to be the side of the desk. It's going to be an overall commitment to excellence. Can you give an example of how that commitment to excellence might look now as a result of the stepping back from the term DE?
Well, so you're asking what that commitment to excellence would look like. I think that what it looks like is something that incorporates this notion of diverse excellence into everything that you do. So there's all sorts of ways that companies are missing out on innovations because they simply don't see particular markets or don't understand particular markets. And if you had a more diverse team, you would actually see those possibilities, or you might avoid risks in your products. An example that I always like to give is the like the Fitbit and all these devices that we wear on our wrists. Well, when they originally came out, they actually did not work very well on dark skin for measuring your heart rate or things like that, because the laser has to go through your skin into your blood to be able to measure that. And now they've improved because they've added multicolor lasers and all things like that. But in the beginning, it didn't. And you can imagine, if you don't have a diverse team, as you know, those teams were not. I've looked into it. They didn't have diverse investors. The venture capitalists who invested early in Fitbit also were, just of one homogeneous group. You could imagine they all tried it on and it worked fine for them. And so you have this huge risk they were running because they didn't have a diverse team. That's just like an example of how diverse excellence actually is going to lead to better innovations. And so I think a lot of companies are going to start to think about, how can I just embed these kinds of questions into everything that we do? And so I think that's an example of how I hope it will play out.
Thank you for that example. That is an excellent example. And so let's go on with the Fitbit. And had they not identified that difference, and this might be you repeating some of the information that you said, and I think it's worth repeating. If people thought, oh, okay, well, if we roll back the DEI, we never were committed to it in the first place, and now we don't have to be committed. How will they suffer? How will those companies suffer? Because they may be thinking, hey, I already have customers. Customers are buying my product. People are not going to just quit because we're rolling this back. Are they right? Are they wrong? What do you see as a consequence?
Well, I think there are definitely going to be consequences. And this thing about people won't quit, I think people will quit. We know Gen Z, millennials, even boomers, like I'm like the last boomer. I was born the last year of the baby boom, but like even boomers, people just don't want to work in companies that don't match their values. That's, the research really backs this up. And so Gen Z and millennials really, many of them really do have those strong values around equity and equality, and they're just not going to want to work at a company like this. I have a goddaughter who works at one of these big tech companies, and she's going to leave. And why is she going to leave? Because she sent me a screenshot of hilarious sexist thing that was happening in a meeting. Not hilarious, tragic, but subtle sexism that happens in a meeting, telling people to smile when they're not smiling and things like that. And she's just like, I can't work at this company. So I think there will be consequences. Workers are going to leave. So that's one consequence.
Yes.
I think another consequence that is, I mentioned earlier, is also just you're going to lack innovation. Innovation comes from, diverse perspectives, different mindsets, the conflicts and clashes, tensions, all those kinds of things that happen when you have more diversity. That's how you produce innovation. And so I think, companies are going to be giving up on that. And the research is pretty conclusive that you really are more innovative if you have diverse teams. If you also do the inclusion part, diversity and inclusion, might not get more innovation if you just do diversity because you haven't actually done anything to bring those perspectives in. But if you do, the evidence is very clear that you're going to be more innovative. And then I also think there is public perception. EY just announced that it was pulling back on all of its DEI kind of statements. They're a big consulting firm. They're doing it because they have a lot of government contracts and they're worried about that. But I think a lot of other organizations are going to think, hey, wait, do I really want to work with a consulting firm that is not committed on those? Is that consistent with our values? And so I think maybe they're going to keep some of those government contracts, but are they going to lose other business? It's, remains to be seen. But I think those are different kinds of risks that companies can run if they walk back on the DEI commitment.
Great. So thinking back about your goddaughter, what are some of the things that she can do before she actually makes her move? Is there anything that she can do in the meantime?
Well, so I think people who are in organizations that are not committed to DEI in some way, and, they have kind of couple choices. One is walk with their feet. Why go through the pain of working in an organization that doesn't match your values? Life is short, walk with your feet. Yeah. Not everyone can do that. Let's say You're really dependent on that income. And there's not another job opportunity right now. You have to stay. Or let's just say you care about the company, you are interested in the products that it's producing, and you really want to be a change agent from within. Those are all possible scenarios. There's lots that you can do. Simple things like asking questions. Like, gee, look at this slate of candidates for this job. It's not that diverse. Have we tried to look for other people? Or why is that criterion in the list of criteria that we have, that we have for this job? Does that make sense? Is that allowing us to really get the best talent? So, one simple thing you can do, someone like, okay, my goddaughter is very, very junior. So you don't have any power in the company. The only power you really have is the power to ask questions. And so that's a thing that almost anyone in an organization can do. And then, of course, if you're more senior, there's a lot more that you can do. You can be that person who is investing in making those changes and fighting for them and demonstrating that when you make those changes, you actually have higher functioning teams and more innovative outputs and, greater excellence. So it depends where you are in the organization, what your degrees of freedom are in terms of the actions that you can take.
I like that. So, and I also like the fact that, it's so important for us to really understand our values and live by those values, not question the values and not question ourselves. Take the time to understand that. So for those that are listening, think about the best company you've ever worked for, the one that seemed to do everything right. Now imagine it 5 or 10 years later. Is it still thriving or did it start to slip? Research shows that even the strongest companies don't stay on top forever. And here's why that matters. The same is true for your career. If you don't evolve, if you just stand still, you will fall behind. And I know your research has shown that even market-leading companies can't sustain long-term excellence. Why does this happen, and what are the warning signs that a company or even an individual has hit a growth plateau?
Well, it's a challenge for every company. As you get bigger, you get more locked in. You have certain ways of doing things. You have those routines. And those routines can get you in trouble because there's other startups and other companies that are innovating in ways. And if you don't innovate at the pace and the scale of the market, then you are at risk. I mean, if you look at the S&P 500 list from 50 years ago and the list today, that there's not a huge overlap in the names of the companies. So many companies have faced the challenges that you're describing. And so I think the big question is, how do we sustain innovation? How do we innovate at the pace and the scale of the market? And, I wrote about this even in my earliest work, Creative Destruction. We talked about one of the key things that allows you to innovate is looking at the periphery. So, seeing what's happening in the marketplace. And to connect it to our conversation about DEI, one of the best ways that you can look at the periphery is by having a more diverse workforce that is actually bringing these different insights in. And so if you want to innovate to survive and sustain and, remain, with a competitive advantage in whatever market you're working at, then you're not going to be able to do that if everyone in your company looks exactly the same. You're going to be locked into a particular mindset. You're not going to have that openness to the possibilities of innovation and the things that competition or emerging new startups could actually produce. So I think that's, there's a real connection between this kind of creative destruction and this conversation about diversity inside organizations. And that's one of the connections.
So for the professionals that are listening today, how should they apply this insight into their careers? Like, what can they be looking for in themselves and what can they be looking for in their company to really see where everything is going?
Yeah, I like that you asked it, that you kind of connected what's happening in the company with what's happening in the person, because a lot of the things that you do, like, to be able to be more effective on the innovation front, you should be listening to diverse perspectives, be willing to be wrong, have a learning mindset so that you can actually change and grow in terms of learning about what's happening in your marketplace and what you need to do. And all of those things actually lead to, greater job satisfaction. Like if you have a learning mindset, if you're willing to be wrong, if you're willing to say, oh, that's really interesting and that's really different than what I've been doing before, or wow, now my skill set is outmoded, but I'm going to learn something else. These are all things that lead to greater job satisfaction and greater personal satisfaction. So, connecting what do we do to help the company with what do I do to help learn and grow myself, I think is a really nice way to think about this challenge.
I always think of myself early on in my career. I had a mentor tell me, Natalie, you always got to be having a palm sweating moment, trying something different that you never did before. And, just putting yourself out there. And I've actually literally think, okay, what was my palm sweating moment of the day or at least the week? And if I haven't had that, then I got to challenge myself. And in the end, I love discovering, holy cow, I didn't know I had that in me.
Well, yes, exactly. I like that phrasing of palm sweaty moment. I think we have to take risks. We have to, if we're going to be successful as innovators, as as leaders in organizations, we are going to have those palm sweaty moments. We are going to have to feel uncomfortable. And the discomfort could be coming from taking a risk on something that I hadn't done before. It could be from listening to people, to different stakeholders who are saying something. They may even be saying something negative about me or my company, but there's something to learn about that. If you get all defensive and you pull back, you refuse to have the sweaty palm moment, then you're not going to learn, you're not going to innovate, and you're not going to grow. So I like that it points out that discomfort, we shouldn't be afraid of discomfort. And I think that's another reason that we have this pushback on DEI is that, being around people who aren't exactly like us sometimes does create discomfort. It also creates huge benefits and great joys and wonderful insights and incredible opportunities for growth. But if you're completely unwilling to be uncomfortable ever, then you're not going to be an innovative and transformational leader. And I love the way that you push yourself to do that.
Thank you. So not every company has a chief diversity officer or a DEI program. And honestly, even those that often do, as we said before, struggle to create real change. But here's the surprising thing. Some of these most inclusive workplaces don't rely on a top-down initiative. Instead, they focus on something much deeper. And so if a company doesn't have that formal DEI or just a program to promote excellence and inclusion, what are some of the most effective ways they can still build an inclusive culture?
So some of the answer to that question is what we were just talking about, which is as individuals, we have to be personally committed to creating inclusive excellence. And so we have to be asking those questions, seeking out information, getting diverse perspectives, really pushing. So there's a lot that we can do as individuals. But I don't want to walk back from the fact that actually we know the research very clearly shows that you cannot just rely on the bottoms up. You cannot just rely on individuals, because if you don't have senior executives committed and flying air cover that protects people who are trying to make change in the organization, if you don't have DEI officers who actually are measuring and monitoring and building, helping people build skill sets to be able to, manage diverse teams, you aren't going to do as well. So I don't want to walk back from you could call it top down, but these organizational level commitments, I think that's still incredibly crucial. And I worry that these companies who are now absorbing these functions, getting rid of them, they're actually going to lose their ability. What does a DEI office do in the best case scenario? It's really building best practice and it's a center of excellence for how to be more inclusive. And if you don't have a center of excellence, it may be harder for these individuals that you were talking about to do the work that they need to do. So both are important. And the research is pretty conclusive that if you don't have that top down, you aren't going to make the kind of progress that you want on having that innovative and inclusive excellence.
These are important points that we're making. And as an individual that are in this environment, what are some of the mindset shifts that we need to have in order to be effective advocates or even using our feet? And how do we balance patience with persistence and also just activity?
Yeah. So I started our conversation, or earlier in our conversation, I talked about the fact that there's been a real misunderstanding and misperception of inclusion in organizations. And so part of the mindset shift, I think, really is to really understand what inclusion can get you. I don't want to make the business case because as you've heard from me, there very clearly is a business case for being more inclusive in terms of innovation, in terms of competitive advantage. However, many organizations, they start with the business case. They say, prove to me that this is going to lead to better performance. And when you start with the business case, you don't get the change and the transformation that you want. And so I think we really need to start with how are we going to create an excellent organization, and then the business case will follow. So I think that's one really important mindset change
That's good.
that needs to be made. The second one is, as I said before, the learning and growth mindset. I mean, there is just so much research about how that is just better for you and better for organizations. And we need to build that in particular with all of the crises that we have been facing and are going to continue to face, whether it's climate change, the next pandemic, bird flu pandemic, the big, changes in terms of tariffs, all these kinds of things. If we don't have a learning and growth mindset, these are going to just snow us under. And so I think those are the mindset shifts that I would really emphasize. And then you asked about patience and persistence, and I would say, yes, everyone wants it to be like a quick hit. Just tell me the one thing I need to do. And then, and if you ask anyone, it's not one thing, it's 1,000 things, and that it doesn't pay out. The Nike example I started with wasn't like one day they suddenly were better. It was a journey of transformation. And so I think if you really want to be successful, you're going to have that patience and persistence, and understand it's a journey, understand that you're going to have some slip ups, understand that not everything is going to go perfectly, understand that you're going to see the payoffs, down the road. And how can you create little mini milestones or things like that that give you that sense of success as you go, at the same time understanding that you're trying to play the long game, not the short-term game. And so patience and persistence really are going to be crucial for any organization that's looking to, survive in these very challenging times.
So for anybody that would like to learn more about you, your books, companies that would like to work with you, where can they find you?
So I would suggest 2 resources. One, I founded the Institute for Gender in the Economy at the Rotman School of Management here at the University of Toronto. That they have a website, gendereconomy.org. I recommend to anyone who's interested. There are so many resources, explainers, videos, podcasts, research briefs. If you want to know stuff, our commitment is to say research, pay attention to what the research has said. And that's a wonderful resource. If you want to know more about me, you can just Google me, but also you can look at my website, which is sarahkaplan.info.in. So, people can find me there as well.
I really appreciate your time, your expertise, everything that you've delivered today. And I am looking forward to seeing how this conversation creates ripple effects. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
So, what have we learned today? Cutting DEI isn't just a political move. It's a business risk. Research shows that companies scaling back on diversity, equity, and inclusion aren't just making a political statement, they're making a financial misstep. Companies in the top quartile for diversity outperform their peers by 9%, while those in the bottom quartile are 66% more likely to underperform. Ignoring DEI doesn't just hurt workers, it hurts the bottom line. Privilege is like the wind in your sails. You don't feel it until it's gone. We all move through life with advantages and disadvantages, some seen, some unseen. The biggest mistake we can make is assuming that our experience is the same for everyone. Companies that don't recognize these hidden forces, whether it's bias in hiring, product development, or leadership, end up missing huge opportunities. Just ask Fitbit. Their oversight in product testing meant their wearables didn't work for people with darker skin tones, costing them market trust and credibility. Innovation thrives in diversity, and so do careers. The most successful companies and professionals don't just survive change, they anticipate it, embrace it, and innovate through it. That's why today's conversation with Sarah Kaplan was so important. She showed us how companies like Nike faced major ethical and financial trade-offs, but chose to innovate instead of retreating. So, here's my question for you. If your workplace is pulling back on inclusion and innovation, What does that mean for your future? Are you staying somewhere that's growing or somewhere that's playing defense? Because if the ship is sinking, maybe it's time to grab a lifeboat. Which brings us to next week's episode. Ever dealt with a bully boss who made you second guess yourself? Or maybe you've worked for a narcissistic leader who took credit for your ideas, but blamed you when things went wrong. You're not alone. Research shows that 75% of employees don't leave bad jobs. They leave bad bosses. But here's the twist. Those who leave toxic workplaces often find better pay, better opportunities, and greater job satisfaction. Next week, we're continuing to tackle hidden barriers in your career. The ones that don't show up on a performance review, but absolutely hold you back. I'll be joined by Patricia Stepp, Assistant Vice President of Technology Transfer, a leader in intellectual property and innovation. But her career growth, it started with one decision: to walk away from a toxic workplace. We're going to unpack the warning signs of a bully boss, how to navigate career pivots with confidence, and why diverse leadership isn't just ethical, it's a competitive advantage. If you've ever felt stuck in a job where leadership was holding you back, this episode is for you. It's time to reclaim your confidence, take control of your career, and step into the leadership path you deserve. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. See you next time.